I'm Chris Farrell from the official GonnaGeek.com podcast, a proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other geeky podcasts over at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to episode 107 of Better Podcasting. Today, we get techie and tell you all about podcasting PC hardware.
In this week's Better Podcasting Download, we talk about social media moderation, the good, the bad, the ugly, and me, the smelly.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we have fun reading what you sent to us.
Lauren, crank up that oven. We got an American turkey to fry up. Let's just do it.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 107 of Better Podcasting. My name is Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is Stargate Pioneer.
Please call me SP. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. I hope you have a great holiday season. We kicked it off last week with episode 106, telling you how to cope with the holidays. We're going to continue on that thread this week and get techie with some upgrade gear parameters. And we love talking about hobby podcasting because we want to make your podcast better. So anything we can do to help you, we love to do.
Absolutely. And you know what else we like to do from time to time? We like to give back to the podcast community. And we today are proud to present a brand new contest. This contest is going to run until January 31st, 2018. What? That's January 31st, 2018. We are going to take entries to give away a brand new Audio-Technica AT2005. This is the USB XLR microphone, one of the many that are very similar to this. This is the Audio-Technica AT2005. We've given away the ATR 2100 before, which is basically the same as this, and it comes with a wonderful little stand inside that is okay in a pinch, but honestly really not that great. But yes, we're going to give this away, and how you can enter to possibly win is by sending us an email to contest@betterpodcasting.com. That's contest@betterpodcasting.com. And what we want you to do, because this contest is running through the end of the year into the first month of 2018, we want you to tell us what was your favorite moment of Better Podcasting in 2017. So narrow it down to one. What was your favorite? And just send that in to contest@betterpodcasting.com, and we will enter you into the big draw barrel, which SP still does not own.
No, we're going way back to the beginning of the podcast. I said I'd do a little bingo drum. We'll see if I can't find one. If not, there's the geeky hat draw that we've been doing for a while. Yes, we are giving away an Audio-Technica AT2005 USB and XLR microphone. This microphone is one that we would highly recommend that you have in your arsenal, that you start with if possible. It's a dynamic microphone and it has both USB and XLR capabilities. And we are looking forward to hearing from you on what your favorite Better Podcasting moment is in 2017. Once again, send that to contest@betterpodcasting.com. You can send us just an email. You can send us a link to an audio or video file. And we would love to be able to play those on the show during the next 2 months as this contest is running, so we can point to other people what your favorite moments were of Better Podcasting.
You know what else would be great aside from the contest? It would be great if people would send us a how I saved my podcast story. It's been a while since we've gotten a submission, and so we want you to tell us, how have you saved your podcast? This is unrelated to the contest, because this sending us a how I saved my podcast story will not enter you into the contest. You have to follow the contest parameters we just laid out. but we still want to know from you, how have you saved your podcast? Please get in touch with us through any of the ways that SP has mentioned, and video, audio, whatever, or just text, script. Just let us know. We want to know, how have you saved your podcast?
Yep. Send it to podcast@betterpodcasting.com. This is separate from the contest, which is contest@betterpodcasting.com.
You know, a couple years back, you actually saved your podcast by buying new PC components. Yes, today we are getting into my roots. That's right, I was a techie long before I was a podcaster. I remember me and the older brother were sitting around our 386. Look at this modern, revolutionary piece of technology. And oh, what is this? Oh, look at this cool preview that my dad has for this Windows 95 thing. Wow. Yeah, that's right. I was a techie a long time before this. And so today we're going to get all technical, and believe it or not, this was actually SP's idea to do this. And so we're going to run down some basic components that you might want to be aware of as a hobby podcaster, because as hobby podcasters ourselves, we realize that often when you start podcasting with production tools, you've already got some that are available to us, like tablets and smartphones and laptops and desktops. Inevitably, eventually, you are going to process your audio or video and maybe decide that podcasting is something that you really want to improve on. And so that leads to the ultimate question: is what I have enough? And more importantly, what is enough? So we definitely recognize that tablets and smartphones are capable of producing content. And while neither of us really want a regular routine and her production workflow to be on mobile devices just yet, it is coming, and we look forward to that day. But today in November 2017, Better Podcasting does recommend making sure to have some form of actual physical, like laptop or desktop, something that isn't tablet or smartphone, for the production of your podcast. We just think that it offers a better experience for you as the hobbyist, sometimes a little less frustrating. So ultimately, that's why today we want to talk about some of the components that are within PCs.
Yeah, since we are recording this episode at the highlight of the holiday purchasing season in the fall of 2017, we realize that you're looking for those deals, or you might be looking for those deals, both on new hardware or maybe upgrading your current hardware. And with that in mind, we hope to help steer you in the right direction in your decision process on what would be a good purchase to help your show for the next year or two. Usually tech purchases you make for a year or two in podcasting. We'll run down the specific computer components, what they're used for, and what some decent parameters are, at least now, for podcasting. We will not be touching in depth on internet connectivity or bandwidth. But if you do a show kind of like what Stephen and I are doing right now, where you have geographically separated co-hosts, or maybe you're reaching out to guests that Skype in or telephone in, you'll need the appropriate internet connection to handle either just the plain audio connection or your video connection, depending on what you're doing in your show, or both, really. So let's start off with the processor, the microprocessor. This goes back to, Stephen, the microprocessor came about in 1971.
What?
It's been around for a while, but the computer components that we have today are very much advanced from what they first came out with in 1971. So the component, the processor, actually does the computation. It actually does the bits and bytes, the ones and zeros in your device. Now, there's three parameters that you have to look at for a processor: what type it is, what the speed is, the clock speed of the processor, and how many cores are in the processor. So let's start off with the type. You might have heard of Intel processors. You might have heard their jingle once or twice when you're watching TV. These are 64-bit processors, and they come in the types of i3, i5, and i7. And then there's multiple generations. And the way you can tell the generation is usually the first letter or the first number in a 4-number sequence will tell you the generation. Like 5500, that's the 5th generation processor. 6500, that's a 6th generation processor. Right now, as we're recording this, there are 8 generations of processor. But aside from that, the higher the number you go in I numbers, like i3 to i7 is the more capable out of those 3. And for podcasting, I would recommend that you do at least an i5, if not an i7. And some of the techie versions of the names that you might hear are like Sandy Bridge. You remember the Sandy Bridge processor? That was pretty big when it came out. A lot of people had a lot to say about that. Another processor type or company that actually produces microprocessors is AMD. You might have heard of the Athlon series or the Phenom 2 series or whatever. Right now, the Ryzen series seems to be the big one that AMD is producing. Once again, you want the highest number out of that because it's going to, that you can afford, because it's going to give you the better processes. And of course, like Apple, I'm not sure what Samsung uses for their processors, because quite frankly, I haven't paid attention to the Android market. But Apple, you might hear of an A series chip. Right now, in the iPhone 8 and the iPhone X, they're on the A10 processors, and they all go all the way back to A4 through A10. So if you happen to have an iOS device, you want the highest A number chip that you can afford to do the processing. So processors, in addition to the type, they also have a speed associated with them. So basically, the faster the speed, the faster the chip is going to be able to process the data. However, let me make this clear. The faster the chip is and the higher number and the more capable the chip is, the more heat it is going to generate. So you're going to have a bigger fan, a bigger heatsink, and bigger airflow within your computer. That is why mobile laptop processors are a little less capable than actual PC processors, because there's just not enough airflow in there. There's not enough power sometimes to really drive them. So speed and heat are things that contradict each other, and you have to make sure you have enough heat to handle the speed that you have. Also, processors have cores, and these is basically you're dividing the processor into different pieces. So a lot of the desktop processors available now have 4 to 8 cores. So it can handle simultaneously 4 to 8 different processes. With a laptop, you want at least 2, if not 4 cores. But again, if you go up to that 4 cores, you're generating a lot more heat, and you have to make sure that your laptop is capable of cooling all that heat. So basically, as far as processors go, this is almost the heart of your computer. It kind of is the heart of your computer, and we'll get to the other thing that's essential to your computer in a second. But you want to buy the best capability that you can afford. Yes, you can go in later and change this up, but this is not a component that is easy to change out, because you have to wipe off the magnetic paste that goes in between the processor and the motherboard where it's seated, and you have to make sure that you apply the new paste appropriately. So it is a little bit more technically involved than other components to do.
It is.
So if you're not really into the tech, you might just want to have the best processor available for the computer and have the computer for 2 to 4 years, and then just get another computer with another processor. But don't forget about the cooling. Do not pack too much processor into a small case without any airflow.
Absolutely. And for what it's worth, by the way, processor replacement, back when I was young, Stephen John Drew, you really had to be very careful, because you could very easily break the processor. Like when you were swapping it out, they've made it a lot more dummy proof. But again, because of the heat, you want to be careful that this is not something that you take lightly. And if you know somebody who's good with this sort of stuff and you're wanting to do a processor upgrade, ask them for help, because you still can mess it up. The thing that your processor goes into, though, is called your motherboard. What? The motherboard? But why I have a fatherboard? What? No, it's called a motherboard. The motherboard is essentially the central hub of the computer. Now, all your components essentially go into this motherboard in some way or another. The motherboard that you have is largely driven by the processor that you're using, because the processors are different shapes and different types and different generations. And so your motherboard has to be able to support that. And unfortunately, it's not one of these like one size fits all things. No, it is a matter of your motherboard has to have the right processor type. So you're going to be very limited with what sort of motherboard you can get depending on that processor you have, because generally a processor is more expensive than the motherboard. Now, the other thing that you need to remember with motherboards is they come in a variety of different types. And what I mean by that is that sometimes they have integrated peripherals like sound cards and video cards and things like that we'll talk about in a moment. They have those built right in, and other times they are just bare bones. So if you are getting one that has these components built in, usually it's good enough for sort of day-to-day use. Maybe you're not doing anything video intensive. If you get lucky, the sound will be pretty good. The sound is generally, average on there, but sometimes they are a little noisier than a dedicated sound card, but they have a lot of built-in components in them sometimes. The other thing as well that you need to take note of is the memory slot type. The memory we're going to talk about in a minute, again, comes in different types. And if you don't have the right slot for your memory, then obviously you're going to run into some problems, because memory changes just as fast as processors, so it seems. And so if you have a mismatch there, it's just not going to work. There's also different levels of quality of motherboards. If you go with something super cheap, you might end up finding that it dies on you sooner. And the problem is, as I mentioned, everything kind of ties into your motherboard. So if something goes wrong with your motherboard, there's a chance it could impact the rest of your components. Back when I did work in sort of the tech field, often I would get people bringing in cheaper computers, and sometimes not always just cheaper, but a lot of times it was cheaper. And what we would find is that the capacitors, those little silver or black cylinders, if you've ever popped open your computer and seen those little silver or black cylinders, yeah, those are capacitors. And a lot of times they would pop. So you'd end up with a sort of rusty color ooze from the top. And once that goes, there's no fixing it, because you can't fix a motherboard. It's replacement. And that can cause all sorts of other problems, random restarts, random crashes. It can just cause, like I said, other components to die. So definitely your motherboard is something that you should spend a little bit more on if you are looking to buy one, because it is the hub of your computer.
I've had two motherboards go bad on me recently, one in a laptop, one in my desktop, actually my previous podcasting desktop. And I tried to change out the motherboards, and it had just caused so much downstream damage that it was just easier in both cases to get a new computer. Yes, I could turn both those computers on right now, but they are severely hampered in their processing power. So just keep that in mind. When the motherboards go bad, it can take out your entire computer. So you want to keep them, again, as cool as possible. So one thing that plugs directly into the motherboard is the memory, as Stephen mentioned, and this often is called RAM, or random access memory. This is a pivotal component to your PC or your laptop. And in most cases, it's easily removable and an easy upgrade if you don't have enough RAM. So RAM is literally the short-term memory in your computer. You ever see 50 First Dates, Stephen?
I have, yes.
Yes. So it's like that sort of short-term memory where you turn the computer off and boop, you're starting all over again. So RAM has a type, a speed, and the amount of memory. So the type is more important, as Stephen mentioned, because you need to match it to the motherboard. They are labeled on the stick. I actually have a couple that I'm holding up on the YouTube if you want to see what they look like. They're just little strips, and some common types that you will know now are a PC3 or a PC2 memory type. And you will see one of these is a PC3 and one is a PC2. And if you look on the YouTube, you will see that the plugins, which I'm holding right up to next to each other, are not the same. They are different. So they will be different in your motherboard. So you have to have the correct memory for your board. Now, if you are upgrading, it's really easy. You can look at these sticks and they have a sticker on it. And on the sticker will tell you exactly what's in there. So if you're simply trying to upgrade, take a look at what type it is, a DDR4, DDR3, DDR2, or also known as PC2, PC3, PC4, and the amount of memory. And then you just buy something that's bigger. Not all motherboards can take all sticks. So there's like 32 gigabyte RAM cards out there right now. Your motherboard might only be able to take up to 16 gigabytes. So make sure you check with the motherboard what it can actually take. So aside from the type, the speed is important as well. And the speed is labeled on the RAM right after the type. Like I'm looking at mine right now, it says PC3 12,800. So that's the speed, 12,800. And that is the speed of which your processor is able to access the memory. And it is important to get the highest speed that you can, but it's also most important to make sure the speed is the same throughout all of your RAM cards. So your processor isn't having to work more looking at different speeds throughout your RAM. And finally, the RAM has an amount to it. So you can get cards as down to 1 gigabytes and as much as I said as 32 gigabytes. Usually in the price ranges you're talking about 4 gigabyte to 16 gigabyte cards. And basically you want to have in your computer, depending on how many slots is available, you want to have at least 8 gigabytes, preferably 16 gigabytes if you are doing audio, and probably somewhere between 16 and 32 minimum if you are doing video. So if your computer does not have that, but you are doing those intense processes and you can upgrade to those amounts, then I would highly recommend that you grab a deal this holiday buying season and upgrade your RAM. It's relatively cheap for what you get.
Absolutely. One other thing that you might consider upgrading, especially if you're about to do some video stuff along with your podcast, is the graphics card. The graphics card is essentially a boost for the processor portion that deals with the videos type of stuff. A graphics card, as I mentioned earlier, can be integrated, a built-in part of the motherboard, but those are very simple and there's certain things that they don't do, and sometimes they don't do them very efficiently. So when you are starting to get into video stuff, if you get an actual proper dedicated video card, it can definitely give you that kick that you need to do things in a lot more stable and fast manner. So a graphics card is definitely a consideration if you're getting into anything video. Now, one thing that you need to remember with this is that graphics cards generally right now use what's called a PCI Express port. And this is something that the PCI Express plug-in port has to be on your motherboard. Older motherboards might have what's called AGP, that is an older style of slot for video cards. So definitely make sure that you've got that on there. There's also PCI Express, comes in a variety of different types. Like there's one that's X16, there are some that are not. So you really need to make sure that when you're looking at a video card, your motherboard has that. I was going to talk a bit about that in motherboards, but I thought it's more relevant with video cards. You need to make sure that your video card slot that you need for your video card is on your board. And so those two things you really got to pay attention to, because if you don't have the right lineup of those, you might buy yourself a really good video card, but it won't work at full speed. So you definitely got to pay attention to that. Obviously, the more speed that a video card has, the better. However, did you know that video cards also have memory of their own? That's right. SP talked all about memory, and you'll see that video cards come in different types of memory. Like they'll have, a gigabyte of memory, or they can have 4 gigs of memory. They can go higher. So it is something that you definitely want to pay attention to the video card memory, because if it doesn't have enough, it's essentially going to kind of stifle a little bit of what you're doing. So definitely pay attention to that. And the other thing as well is that video cards produce a lot of heat, just like your processor. So some of them have very, very large fans. Some of them have 2 fans. Some of them don't really use fans, but those generally aren't the fastest video cards, but you might not need the fastest video cards. If you want to know all about the high-end video cards, find yourself a PC gamer to talk to. A PC gamer will tell you all about what you need to know with video cards, because the video card is one of the core features of a gamer.
One of the other great things about the video cards is it'll enable you to go into multiple monitors, usually somewhere between 3 and 8. And you can have a multiple monitor setup, which with podcasting is excellent, especially if you're editing or doing video. So you can have multiple things up on the screen. Matter of fact, Steven could not do what he was doing right now unless he had 4 to 6 monitors up at any given time. So he does that because he has a video graphics card. I also upped my video graphics card from the original to a better one just because I wanted to max that puppy out. I knew it was going to be doing video production and I wanted to be able to do something better. So what I'm holding up on YouTube right now is actually the one that I took out of my gaming machine. This is actually a gaming video card. It's on the small side, but it is still a very capable card. So if you want to check that out, go to the YouTube channel. It's got a very large fan and it's got 4 HDMI ports and then a DVI port. Only 4 of these can be active at any one time. It's an AMD Radeon R9 390X card, but it has 8 gigabytes of memory. That's just an example. It has a lot of capability because of that memory in it. And it's a GDDR5 type of card for those techies out there that are wondering, I wonder if that will fit in my setup that I have right now. So moving ahead just a little bit, we have storage, which is another component in your laptop or your desktop. So there are different types. You have a traditional hard disk drive. You have also the solid state drive. And in between the two of them, you have different sizes. You have a 3.5 inch hard disk drive that can go into a desktop. And you can also put a 2.5 inch drive in your desktop, but more than not, your laptop has them, except for now they have cards that is an M.2 solid state drive storage card, which is different than the ones I'm about to show you on YouTube. So a hard disk drive, it can generally store more data, somewhere between like right now in November 2017, 1 terabyte to 12 terabyte. I saw a 12 terabyte deal in the last week and I was looking at that disk drive going, wow, 12 terabytes. People used to have to put together home servers to get 12 terabytes. Now you can get them in one disk. It's going to cost you a little bit, but you can get them. So this is what I'm holding up on YouTube. This is what a 3.5 inch hard disk drive actually looks like. And then if you want to compare it to the 2.5 inch disk drive, you can, like I said, using some sort of interface or adapter, you can put the 2.5 inch drive or a couple of them actually, maybe even up to 3 in the slot made for this 3.5 inch drive. It's going to generate more heat, so you have to make sure you have the cooling in your system, but you can put a lot of these 2.5 drives in. Then also what they've done lately is they've moved away from the actual spinning discs. The drives that I just held up actually have spinning discs in them, so they're mechanical hard drives. Now they've gone to solid state storage. So it's basically a 2.5 inch drive fit form, but it's just an electronic storage card. Now they have even moved away from this fit form and gone to what's known as an M.2 form, which is a long card. I actually don't have one to show you. I have one in the house, but it's actually in a computer, so I'm not able to take that out. So there's a couple of things with hard drives that I want to tell you before you go ahead and buy one. First of all, if you're going for mass storage, you want to get a hard disk drive because the solid state drives are just prohibitively expensive right now. And in some cases don't even have the ability to go up that high in storage to the 12 terabyte range with solid state drives. So if you're talking a lot of audio or video files, you want to go with a hard disk drive. Ideally, if you do that, you want to also go with a solid state drive to then use that as your operating system and make it faster. But if you do a hard disk drive, it spins at different speeds. And the two speeds you will hear most frequently are 5,400 RPMs and 7,200 RPMs. Trust me, you do not want to run your computer off a 5,400 RPM drive. I do that with my laptop just to get 2 terabytes out of it, and it is frustrating having to wait 5 minutes for that thing to boot up. So do yourself a favor, and if you're running 2 drives, or if you're running a hard disk drive, make sure it's a 72,000 RPM drive.
2 quick notes on the drives as well. Number 1, I will emphasize what SP said. If you can get an SSD, do it. It is such a fast upgrade. It is amazing how many computers I've personally given more life because I upgraded them to an SSD card. And it is amazing how many people I've had tell me the same thing. Oh, wow, you were right. Such a big speed difference, because just the way that it works with a traditional drive, things are actually physically spinning and it has to read those. With an SSD drive, it's not. It's a lot faster. It's kind of like an SD card where it's just right there. So absolutely an SSD card, if you can make that your primary operating system hard drive, it will speed things up quite a bit, including, in my experience, rendering times of your podcast. You know how you're waiting for Audacity or Audition to save? Yeah, that sped that up for me. The other thing to note is the 5400 RPM drive, absolutely for an average capacity drive, stay away from that. There is a footnote that as we get with the bigger drives, it's becoming less of an impact. And what I mean by that is, like, if you picture a drive that's spinning, a disk that's spinning, it has to basically read based off of the amount of how fast that it's reading, or how fast it's spinning. So obviously a faster spin means a faster read. Well, the thing that you also need to remember is that if the hard drive, if it's the same physical size and now you're putting more data on it, but the hard drive is staying the same size, then obviously it's inherently reading more information at that slower speed, because the hard drive is essentially keeping the data in smaller form fit. So when you start to get into the very, very large drives, the 6 terabytes and higher, it's less of an impact. But for the average Joe, you're looking at like a 1-2 terabyte hard drive. Stay away from 5400. But I just wanted to preface that and emphasize that, because I know otherwise we'd have our techie people writing us saying that's not entirely true.
Okay, a couple more things about hard drives. First of all, I'm going to give you a better podcasting exclusive. I'm holding up on the YouTube, for the YouTube viewers, the 6 terabyte drive that this weekend is going to go into my computer. So I am increasing my podcast, video, and audio storage drive from 4 terabytes to 6 terabytes this very weekend. So it is possible to do this. And this is the other thing I wanted to say. It is very easy mechanically to switch out these hard drives. It is a little bit more problematic to make sure that the drives transfer their information. For an operating system drive, you have to make sure that you put the operating system on. So say you're working Windows 10, you got to make sure that the Windows 10 loads up. You may have to make sure all your programs load up. Yes, you can clone drives, but with solid state drives, it's a little bit more problematic. And then also, what I'm going to do, since this is just a storage drive, I'm going to copy all the information with an external enclosure that plugs into my USB 3 port before I switch the drives out. So my computer will always be operational until I do the hard disk drive actual swap and start it up with the new hard drive in there. So just things to remember. It is a little bit more techy, but it is easily doable if you follow instructions, and definitely have another computer around the house in case you run into problems. You're like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? And you can Google and find out what you need to do. And finally, Stephen, what do we have as the final component that we're going to cover?
A USB hub. And the reason we want to talk about USB hubs is because when you get back to that motherboard that I told you about, when you look at the back of it, there's only so many USB plugs. And unfortunately, as a podcaster, you probably use a lot of them, because you might have a microphone plugged in through USB, but you might also have sitting there your mouse plugged in by USB. Oh, look, I also have a webcam plugged in by USB. And what else do I have? Oh, I have a SD card reader that's plugged in by USB, but that's all 4 of my USB ports, but I need more. So absolutely, a USB hub is an important component that is an external component, but something that we wanted to talk about because more and more podcasters are needing these. They're essentially a USB splitter. Think of it that way. Often what you want to pay attention to is making sure that it is USB 3 capable, because USB 3 is the current technology, and is quite a bit faster than what was around for a long time called USB 2. So you want to make sure generally that you're set to go with that. Now, pay attention, look at the fine print, because technically when USB 3 came out, there was all sorts of hurrah about USB 3 not being capable with USB 2, but most of the stuff does say USB 3 back compatible to USB 2, but just a little disclaimer on that. Make sure you check that out. But definitely make sure that you're paying attention if you are suddenly getting to the point that you're running out of USB plugs. you might want to get yourself a USB hub because this will definitely help you. Now, one thing that you want to keep in mind is that if you can get one that is powered, it's going to help you, because if you have, think of it this way, if you have a USB hub, a splitter, it's got to get its power from somewhere. So it's going to get its power from the computer. Well, if you have all these devices sucking up that power, there's the potential that they take too much of that current and you run into some problems. So if you get a USB hub that has an external power source, it kind of it supplements that, and it makes sure that you're constantly getting the same amount of power to all of those devices. The other thing that you can do with that is, of course, then hook up extra components like an SD card reader that can speed things up as a podcaster, because maybe you, instead of having to plug in your H6 every time to download, you just pull out your SD card after hitting stop and you put it into your SD card reader.
Indeed. Make sure you transfer your files correctly. Hey, we know that this was a lot of techie data that we went through, and hopefully we've been able to enlighten you as to what specifications you'd want to shoot for or upgrade to. And once again, just to review what we covered processors. Faster is usually more better. Cores are usually more better, but cooling is needed. We covered motherboards and everything that you need to know about that, including make sure you get the correct slots. Memory, faster and more gigabytes is usually better. Graphics cards usually help your graphics processing, but cooling is needed. Storage, SSDs or solid state drives are fast, and hard disk drives are usually more storage, and a combo of both is usually good in your computer. And then peripherals. Where do I plug my ATR 2100 into?
I don't know. So there's obviously a variety of different levels of components and a lot of different qualities of components. Now, ultimately, as the podcaster, it's going to depend on what you see as how far I want this computer to take me, as well as what do I want to do with it. For an average Joe or Jane, just an average podcaster who's just doing audio only, you can probably go a lot lighter with the components. You probably don't need to get as higher tier, but if you're getting into video and things like that, you might want to spend a little bit more money as well. That longevity factor, sometimes if you cheap out on components, you'll have to replace them sooner. And the problem with that is as new generations come out, the old generations become more expensive because they're less in production. So definitely think about what your realistic expectation is. And if you only want a couple of years and you're only going to do audio, maybe you just go a little bit more budget.
So we covered a lot. If you have any thoughts or questions about computer components or computer specifications, go ahead, contact us. And maybe it's something that we didn't cover that you feel that you really needs to be stated about computer components. Go ahead, contact us. Podcast at betterpodcasting.com, at betterpod on Twitter. And you can always catch Steven at our Facebook page, Better Podcasting.
Speaking of Facebook, let's talk a little bit about it.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
You know, there's an old saying, which is that SP needs to keep Steven in line. This dates way back. And as we all know, SP is not actually on Facebook. That's right. The Facebook doesn't like SP, so SP doesn't like the Facebook, which is why he wasn't around this last week to keep me in line. Okay, just joking aside, this past week was honestly a little bit aggravating, but also enlightening for me in the world of Facebook. Now, fair warning in advance, I'm going to share a little bit of a personal gripe, but I got an end story and where we're going with this. I just need to give the backstory before we get to the point. Now, in the past, we've actually talked on this show about how being part of a variety of podcast communities can offer a lot of things. There's some things that can be a little frustrating about them, such as where people always are regularly asking the same question over and over, but there's other things in there that can definitely offer value. So we encourage you to be a part of podcast communities, and we actually talked about that back in episode 72, which you can find at betterpodcasting.com/72. Now, one of the reasons why I, Steven, personally stay around all of these Facebook communities is because there is a lot of engagement that happens back and forth. even in these repeat questions that I mentioned, for example, a lot of people say, what's the best hosting? And to which a bunch of discussion or debate occurs generally. But it's still very intriguing to me because there's a lot of good back and forth, and all of this different perspectives give people who might be asking the same question food for thought. I like the idea of having a bunch of opinions there so someone can make a very informed decision. Now, this past week, I personally encountered some moderation that, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily serve the community that well. The long story short is that somebody posted an internet meme that had Peter Griffin from Family Guy, and it said the following.
You know what really grinds my gears? People who have a podcast, but they're only on YouTube.
Okay, so this is obviously referencing people who call themselves a podcast, even though they're not really one. You know, it'd kind of be like if you were a podcast and you said you were on the radio because you have a podcast. It's not really true. So fair enough. Now, offline in the past, I've actually had some conversations about what is the future of the word podcast. And we've kind of touched briefly on it here before, but it is very interesting to think about because a podcast now is generally pretty clear cut. But where is that going? If we look at other examples like what radio was and what books are even digitally, what's television, it's all evolved. So this is something that to me, I thought is a very interesting perspective. What is the future of podcasts? Because this meme is built on the idea of this person or these people not being in line with what a podcast is. So I totally, to be honest, ended up agreeing with this meme, but I had a little bit of forethought that I thought we should inject into this conversation and just some considerations on the future of that term podcast. And I thought it would just be fun to get a conversation going about where that's happening. And so this is what I posted, and I'll let SP read it.
While I totally agree with the intention of this meme, it frustrates me too because it's totally acceptable in my books to say that you have a YouTube show if that's what it is. But there is a question to be asked as podcasting continues. At which point does the concept of a, quote, podcast, unquote, evolve to something other than the definition of where it started? For example, most people refer to subscription content such as Netflix originals, Amazon Prime Video, CBS All Access exclusives as, quote, television shows, unquote. However, these shows are not on television networks, and for many users aren't even need to be watched on a television itself. Often people watch on iPads, computers, etc. Another great example of this is e-readers. Two people could refer to the reading the same, quote, book, unquote, when one read it in a traditional, quote, book, unquote, but the other read it on an e-reader. Yet the content is still referred to as a, quote, book, unquote. Will this same evolution happen with podcasts one day, where the delivery platform becomes less of a consideration with the term, quote, podcast, unquote? Personally, I don't feel that we're there yet, but I think given the history with other platforms, it's a bit, quote, stick in the mud, unquote, for us to assume that it won't happen with podcasting one day. But again, we're not there yet. So, meme on!
And then I put the little :D, the little grinny face, call back to the olden days before emojis. So the long story short is this actually resulted in a reply and a little bit of a debate over the next day in this Facebook group, which is called, quote, podcast community, end quote. That is the name of it, is podcast community, with a person named Charles Wiltgen. And he disagreed a little bit with my perspective. And, we ended up in a back and forth disagreement debate, citing different sources. And so obviously we just had two different opinions, which is fair enough, because again, I really like the different opinions. I think the different opinions gives food for thought for people who might be considering this. Now, what I ended up finding out afterwards was that Charles was indeed a moderator of this group. And the long story short is that the thread, my reply, just suddenly disappeared. So I assumed that the reason that it was gone was because of the resulting debate. And fair enough. Some people don't want that, even though the rules on that forum do say, or on that group do say that debates are encouraged. I replied again, but this time I said, I understand this might lead to some debate. I'm just not going to respond to that debate I forget what I said, but something essentially to the effect of just to keep it on topic. So anyways, after trying to find out a little bit of information on why this original reply disappeared, the second reply also disappeared, and I had no idea. So after managing to track down some of the moderators, I did end up finding out what the reason was for this deletion, and also my resulting reply that was deleted. And what it was that apparently the moderator Charles had cited that he felt that it was hijacking of the OP's point. Now, obviously, with that there, in my opinion, it's a little bit relevant to what was being said, because the whole concept of the meme is based on the fact that we're talking about what is a quote podcast. So that was interesting for me to see. Now, obviously here, are we just looking to air all of our grievances? No, that's not it at all, because I saved that for Festivus. Seinfeld reference.
Gotta love the Seinfeld. Well, the real reason that we're talking about it is twofold. First, we wanted to talk about how it's our opinion at Better Podcasting that this sort of removal in a group does to encourage podcasting to flourish and its potentials. And it basically, the removal stifles what it could be to new approaches and new diversity of thoughts to podcasting. The meme itself is based on the premise that those who are posting shows on YouTube are not meeting what the original poster's definition of a podcast is. So the discussion of what makes a podcast and how this could change in the future, and basically it's changing right now because of these people that are doing things like YouTube, is relevant food for thought. We wanted to bring this up because it's an overlooked consideration. What is the future of podcasting? Will it continue as we know it? Stephen, I know in the post you had a bunch of citations to support the evolution of radio and television over the years, and this is why it's so fun to theorize on the future term of podcasting, because it does have some historical merit. The second point is that this is our first-hand experience with what we feel is moderators trimming a topic to meet a certain agenda. And this is a really important follow-up to our community discussion, because we never really spoke about how the tone or feel of the group or board could be a factor to consider. For example, if one community is known to be slanted a certain way, then it might not be the type of engagement that you might want to be a part of if you're looking for a variety of opinions to help you make a more well-rounded decision. For example, if you joined a community built around a certain media host, and I know that there are those out there, like PowerPress has help forums, even though it's not really a discussion forum on podcasting, it is owned by the Blueberry family of companies, or Pinecast has a subreddit. Once again, it is not there for podcasting discussion, but it is set there specifically for Pinecast related discussion. You might find that the information is slanted towards them, and you could miss out on alternatives that might be worth considering. So overall, why this did rub us both the wrong way after Stephen told me what happened, we thought it was worth bringing it up here, as it offered a great follow-up to a previous discussion that we had on a previous podcast about podcasting communities. It also highlights that the possibility of content slant that we've mentioned before. Sometimes advice or even posts may be biased a certain direction, and sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's just because that's what the person knows. They're limited in their diversity of thought. And it's worth remembering that this possibility when posting in such communities that we brought up before in episode 72, right?
Yeah.
And finally, this is definitely a good example of when you happen to be moderating a community yourself, to not moderate your own interactions. This brings up a whole bunch of issues. And it's also why a community should be set up, if you're setting up a community, with multiple moderators. So if you find yourself moderating a community and you have no experience doing so, maybe this is your first time, you're just really active in the community, and maybe this is your first time moderating a community, I would encourage you to seek out moderating and facilitating best practices and training, because you're going to need them. At some point in time, there will be some conflict if it's traveled, and by that I mean there's a lot of posts on there. There will be some issues to contend with. I would also get to know your other admins or admin and your fellow moderators that are there, because most moderated communities have some sort of back room dedicated to them, or a separate community like a Facebook group. You're probably not going to have a secretive post capability in that group, but you can have another secretive group just for the moderators. So I would go in there and I would get to know your other moderators. I would ask questions about what is expected in the community after you read the rules and you're very familiar with them, because you're going to have to enforce them whether you like it or not. I would also encourage you to use something like those back rooms or those back channels as an interaction for yourself. If you find yourself needing moderation for an interaction in the community, you're going to have to speak about that to the other mods and the admin, because you're going to need somebody else to do it, because you really can't. I mean, I guess there's a few people in this world that can moderate themselves, but in general, it's just bad practice. So I just wouldn't do that. And finally, if you find yourself moderating a discussion or a debate multiple times, like even within the same post, you owe it not only to the community, but to that specific user specifically to tell them, A, why the comment or post was removed, B, what the community rules or guidelines are that caused the removal, and C, what the proper channels are to post a grievance to the removal, and then more importantly, be available in a timely fashion to respond to that grievance, because these things can spiral out of hand really quick. And these are just best practices to make sure that you take care of that grievance, of that discussion before it gets out of hand, because it can really ruin your community. So those are just some tips and tricks on how to moderate a community. This is really high level, but it's things that you need to take into consideration if you are doing the moderation.
Absolutely. So like I said, a bit of an aggravating week for me last week, but it's their community, their decisions, and it was very enlightening for me. Plus, it gave us content for better podcasting, which is always fun, right? You know, I like content for better podcasting, but absolutely. So keep all those things in mind when you are in any podcast community. That is something that could possibly be happening, or it could just be something that you want to pay attention to, sort of the information that's in there. And also, make sure you tell us, what do you think the future of a podcast is? Because again, I like bringing that up. What is the future of a podcast? Where are we headed with the word podcast? Ultimately, I think the word podcasting is going to end up being what the general public deems it to be. If we here as podcasters are using the original definition, but the public is using something else, well, our audience is the public. So the listeners are going to dictate what a podcast is. What is that? I can't wait to find out. Maybe it won't exist. Maybe the whole world of podcasting will disappear forever, just like gone, poof, gone, removed because of time travel or something like that.
I think there's other reasons that it might happen, and we'll talk about them in a second.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and move on into the Better Pod Back.
This week, we had a lot of feedback from our previous fan of the week, Matt Gull. Yes, Matt Gull was a previous fan of the week on Better Podcasting, the first fan of the week ever since Better Podcasting started, and right now the only fan of the week that we've ever had. We are not reinstating the fan of the week. This is just the previous fan of the week's feedback towards the podcast. So first of all, Matt Gull, who goes by @instructor_Matt on Twitter, said, enjoying the live show with Better Pod. Ever consider starting a hashtag podcast? Check them out at betterpodcasting.com. Thank you very much, Matt.
We also had @instructor_Matt. That sounds familiar. Say, just checked @Stargate Pioneer from @BetterPod and @GonnaGeek off my holiday shopping list. I hope he loves it. To which he sends us a photo of holding up a wonderful BM-800 condenser microphone made by the wonderful, notorious company Florian, which appears to be registered. This is one of the many Dash 800 microphones that are available. They come in a variety of different numbers: NW, NA, SR, SP-800. That's his favorite. No, they come in a whole bunch of different numbers, and SP wants one of these. They usually have the price point about $10 to $12 somewhere in there, and he wants one. It's top on his Christmas.
It's got a pretty golden grill, and I can't wait till I get it because I can't wait to go test drive that brand new 2018 GMC Sierra 4x4 and film myself running over the microphone. We'll see how sturdy the microphone really is. And see if it can hold up to the Shure SM58 fame. Also, Matt Gull responded to us on Facebook, and he wasn't responding to me. He was responding to Steven. He said, "It's a sad day, Steven." And the article he linked was Gibson brand ceases the development of Cakewalk products. And then for those of you that might be new to Better Podcasting, when Steven started this show, he was using a Cakewalk audio interface, was capable of recording multiple channels via FireWire into your computer. And he recently sold that. He had a very sad video of him selling it just a couple weeks ago. And now it's a good thing he sold it. Maybe he had insider information. I'm claiming insider trading.
You want to know what's really, really sad about it is the Cakewalk FA66 that I had originally was made by a company called Edirol, Edirol, to which it had a very successful run. And then Roland picked it up. So Roland picked it up, and that was the one that I had, was Cakewalk FA66 by Roland. It looked exactly the same, except different numbering. However, in 2013, the ownership of Cakewalk was passed from Roland to Gibson, and now Gibson is shutting it down. So it's so sad. It's so sad to see a product gone that is honestly long overdue to be gone. So there you go. For all of those Cakewalk fans out there, you know, it's a sad day.
Sad day indeed. And another sad day is upon us as we record this on November 22nd, 2017. There was recently an American FCC movement to get away from net neutrality. And you can find a lot of articles out there. The specific one I linked was from NBCnews.com. But I posted this. This is just relevant for a lot of reasons. And I just want to say I posted this on Reddit, on the podcast subreddit, and I titled it Podcasting and Net Neutrality. And my post was, if net neutrality ends, and I linked to the NBC News article, but you can pick and choose whatever article you want on this, not necessarily NBC News. So if net neutrality ends, like many are predicting, how do you think it will affect podcasting? Will geographically separated hosts still be able to record over Skype? Will your podcast media host still be available through SEO search? Will Apple maintain their king of the mountain position? What are your thoughts on how the possible end of net neutrality will impact podcasting? And when I posted this, I thought a couple of people would respond. Dude, hundreds of people have upvoted this, and there have been dozens of responses to this. There is a lot of emotion invested in this net neutrality across the internet. So if you have something to say about how you think net neutrality will impact podcasting, you can go over to Reddit and respond to that post, or you can respond to us at any of the means, at BetterPod on Twitter, podcast at betterpodcasting.com, email, or you can catch Steven on our Facebook account, and you can tell us what your thoughts are about this. And there's all sorts of variety of opinions, from the infrastructure needs to be paid for to people actually setting up their own dark webs for free, unlimited internet. I don't know what speed it's going to be at, but this is actually happening across the board, folks, and it might impact podcasting. So that little statement that Steven said before about what is the future of podcasting, this might actually affect podcasting. We don't know how. Like, maybe the limited bandwidth will cause people to search out content like podcasting a little bit more because it's less of a bandwidth. You download the show and then you can play it on your own local machines. Or it could be that your ISP or internet provider won't enable you to get to the point where the podcasts are stored. So there's all sorts of things that could be ramifications for podcasting. I have no idea what this is going to be. And this is something that we're going to keep our eyes on. And this is why I wanted to talk about it in the feedback, because I want to know what your feedback is. So please get a hold of us and we'll talk about it in future show.
Awesome. So that is going to take us towards the end of the show. Before we wrap up, we'll just remind you that we are part of the Gonna Geek Network. And also on the Gonna Geek Network is a show called The Official GonnaGeek.com show. And you can check that out every Monday at 8:45 p.m. Eastern, live at www.geeks.live. It is a weekly show that talks about the world of geek, what's happening. And in the latest episode of the GonnaGeek.com show, one of the participants talked about how the wonderful Amazon Voice Services device has finally come to Canada. I'll give you a hint. That someone was me. So...
Is Canada like the 51st state of the United States?
You know what? I believe that the U.S. had that opportunity, but now opportunity has been passed on.
We need to build that wall.
Awesome. So for episode number 107 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen John Drew saying SP really wants an NW700 or NW800 microphone.
And I'm SP saying happy purchasing of your computer and computer components. See you guys next week.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.